I drove 3 hours through a summer storm to be there when my grandson was born. When I got to the hospital, my son-in-law stood in the doorway and wouldn't let me pass. My daughter looked past his shoulder and said, "Dad, please, not tonight." I turned around and drove to a motel. 20 minutes after I checked in, my phone started ringing, and it didn't stop for the rest of the night. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a claims adjuster for an insurance company in Ohio, the kind of job where you learn to read people by what they don't say. And I raised one daughter, Rachel, mostly alone after her mother passed when Rachel was 9. I tell you that so you understand I am not a man who scares easily, and I am not a man who imagines things. What happened to my family this year I could not have imagined if you'd given me a year to try. The night it started, I was sitting in my recliner with the ball game on mute, because I'd stopped really watching ball games since my wife Carol died. I just liked having something moving in the room. My phone buzzed on the side table. Rachel's name on the screen. I picked it up on the second ring, same as I always did, because old habits don't leave just because they should. "Dad." Her voice had that softness I remembered from when she was small and wanted something. "It's happening. Can you come?" First, I was already reaching for my keys. "Which hospital, sweetheart?" "St. Vincent's, downtown. Dad, drive safe, okay? There's a storm coming in from the west." "I know these roads better than the roads know themselves," I told her. "I'll be there." I threw a bag together without thinking much about what went into it, a change of clothes, my blood pressure pills, and a small brass compass that had belonged to my father, which I'd carried in my jacket pocket every day since Carol's funeral, the way some men carry a lighter or a coin. In the front pocket of the bag I tucked a card I'd bought 3 weeks earlier, pale green with a little fox on the front, which I'd written out and sealed and carried around because I hadn't found the right moment to give it to her yet. Outside, the rain had already started, that first fat, warning kind of rain that tells you worse is coming. The drive should have taken 2.5 hours. The storm made it 3. Somewhere past the county line, the wind got bad enough that I had both hands tight on the wheel and my jaw tight enough to ache. But I kept going, because I had promised, and because for 8 months I had pictured this night, pictured myself in that room, holding my grandson for the first time. Being the grandfather I never quite got to be for Rachel in the way I wanted, since I'd worked so much when she was young. When I finally got to St. Vincent's, soaked through just from the walk across the parking lot, I found the maternity floor and saw my son-in-law, Grant, standing outside room 412 with his arms folded like a man guarding something. "Grant." I nodded at him, catching my breath. "How is she? How's the baby?" He didn't move out of the doorway. "What are you doing here, Walter?" "Rachel called me. Said it was time. She's resting, my mother's with her. We don't need—" He glanced over his shoulder, lowered his voice. "We don't need extra people in there right now." Rachel appeared behind him then, pale, hair stuck to her forehead, and for 1 second her eyes met mine, and I saw something in them I didn't have a name for yet. Then she said, so quiet I almost lost it under the sound of a cart rolling past, "Dad, please, not tonight. I need this to be calm." I have gone over that sentence 100 times since. Not tonight. Not never. Not tonight. Like there would be another night. Like this was a scheduling matter, and not the birth of my only grandchild. I told myself that's what it was. I told myself she was tired and scared and that Grant's mother, a woman named Diane Whitfield who I'd met exactly twice, had simply gotten there first, and Rachel didn't want a crowded room. So I did what I have always done. I didn't argue. I said, "Okay, sweetheart, call me the second he's here." And I turned around and walked back out into the rain. I sat in my truck in the parking garage for a long minute before I could make myself turn the key. Then I drove to the Baymont off the interstate, because I wasn't about to drive 3 hours home and 3 hours back if she called at 2 in the morning. I checked in, didn't say much to the boy at the counter besides thank you, and sat down on the edge of a bed that smelled like carpet cleaner, looking at a phone with no messages on it. That's when it rang. Not Rachel. A number I didn't know. Local area code. "Mr. Halverson." A woman's voice, careful, professional. "This is Nora Feld from the billing office at St. Vincent's. I apologize for the late call. We have a matter involving an authorization on your account that needs your attention tonight." I sat up straighter. "My account? I'm not a patient there." "There's a payment authorization linked to your name and your Medicare number, sir, processed about 40 minutes ago. I wanted to confirm you initiated it before it clears." Askers. 40 minutes ago. I had been standing in a hallway getting told to go home 40 minutes ago. "I didn't authorize anything," I said. "What exactly is this for?" There was a pause. the sound of a keyboard. It looks like a durable medical equipment order. A wheelchair, a hospital bed, home oxygen setup, billed to your Medicare, delivery address listed as, she read off an address I didn't recognize, somewhere, across town, from my house. I felt something go cold and still in my chest, the particular stillness I remembered from 31 years of looking at claims that didn't add up. That's not my address, I said. I need you to stop that authorization right now. She did, and she gave me a case number, and she told me gently that this kind of thing happens sometimes, identity theft, and I should call Medicare's fraud line in the morning. I thanked her and hung up and sat there on the edge of that motel bed with the rain still coming down outside, and my mind went, uninvited, to a Sunday 3 months back. Rachel had come by the house with Grant, said she wanted to scan some of Carol's old recipe cards for a family cookbook she was putting together as a gift, something sentimental, something that had made me tear up a little at the time. She'd borrowed my laptop for maybe 20 minutes while I made coffee. I hadn't thought a thing of it. I still didn't want to think anything of it. But sitting in that motel room, I found I couldn't stop turning it over. I didn't sleep. Around 5 in the morning, my phone rang again, and it was Rachel, exhausted and happy, telling me the baby was here, a boy, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and they'd named him Walter, after me. My eyes went hot and my throat closed up, and for a moment I let myself just be a grandfather, nothing else, glad and grateful, and forgetting the phone call entirely. I told her I was so happy, that I loved her, that I couldn't wait to meet him. She said she'd call when things settled down and I could come by. That call didn't come for 11 days. In those 11 days, I made the mistake of thinking too much, which for a man who spent his career finding the seams in stories, is a dangerous thing to start doing about his own family. I called Medicare's fraud line the next morning like Nora Feld told me to, and a patient woman named Carla walked me through freezing the fraudulent claim and flagging my account. She asked, routine question, if I knew anyone who might have access to my personal information. I said no, out of some old reflex to protect my own family even from a stranger on a phone line, and then sat there afterward feeling sick about the lie. I called my oldest friend, Ray Doyle, that same afternoon. Ray and I had known each other since our 20s, worked adjoining desks for a decade before he moved over to loss prevention investigations and eventually retired a rank above where I ever got. He came over within the hour, still in his gardening clothes, and I showed him the printout of the fraud case and told him about the 20 minutes with the laptop. Ray didn't say much while I talked. He just listened, the way he always had, turning his coffee mug slowly on my kitchen table. When I finished, he said, Walter, I want to look at that laptop. 2. It took him 10 minutes to find it, a small piece of remote access software tucked into the startup programs, disguised under a name that looked almost, but not quite, like a printer driver. Ray sat back in his chair and took off his reading glasses. You understand what this is, he said. It wasn't really a question. Tell me anyway. Someone installed this to watch what you do on this machine. Every password you type, every account you log into, probably every email. This isn't a prank, Walter. This is a federal crime. Unauthorized computer access. And depending what they pulled off your accounts, it could be wire fraud too. I sat with that for a long moment, looking at the little folder of icons Ray had pulled up, thinking about pension statements, thinking about the online banking I did every Sunday morning with my coffee, thinking about the 20 minutes Rachel had my laptop while I made coffee for people who apparently didn't want me at their son's birth. How long has it been running? I asked. Based on the file dates? About 4 months. 4 months. Since well before the recipe cards. I thought about all the Sundays I'd logged into my retirement account to check the balance, all the emails I'd sent to my financial advisor, Diane's name surfacing in my memory now not as Grant's mother but as someone who'd asked, at Thanksgiving, with a kind smile, whether I'd ever thought about simplifying things, moving somewhere with support close by, now that I was on my own. I need to know who's on the other end of this, I said. Not guess. No. Ray nodded slowly. I've got a contact who moved over to the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit a few years back. Woman named Priya Anand. If you want this looked at properly, and not just quietly closed out, she's who you call. I called her the next morning. Priya Anand turned out to be a compact, precise woman in her 40s who listened to my entire account without interrupting once, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so neat it looked typed. When I finished, she asked me a series of questions I hadn't expected about my will, about any documents I might have signed recently, about whether anyone had discussed power of attorney, or moving, or simplifying my finances. They have, I admitted. My daughter's mother-in-law, Diane. At Thanksgiving, I thought she was just being kind. It's a common script, Priya said, not unkindly. Concern first, then documentation, then access. I'd like your permission to look at your accounts for unusual activity over the past 4 months, and I'd like you to think very carefully about anyone who's asked you to sign anything, however small, in that window. That night, I went through the drawer in my kitchen, where I keep what matters. Carol's recipe cards, actually, the real ones, along with old photographs and my father's discharge papers from the army, and I found, tucked inside a folder I barely remembered opening, a document Grant had brought over back in the spring, something he'd called just a standard update, a form granting him limited authority to help manage my accounts in case anything happens while you're on that fishing trip with Ray. I remembered signing it at my own kitchen table, trusting him because he was my son-in-law and because I had no reason yet not to. I photographed every page and sent it to Priya that night. She called first thing the next morning and said one sentence that I will remember until I die. Mr. Halverson, this isn't limited authority. This is a durable power of attorney, and it's broad enough that if it had been recorded with your bank, they could have moved your retirement accounts without your signature at all. It took Priya's team 6 weeks to build the real picture, and I want to tell you plainly, because the comments on stories like mine always ask, and they deserve an honest answer. It was not one bad man. It was a small, patient operation. Grant had gambling debts he'd hidden from Rachel for 2 years, debts to people who do not send polite reminder letters. Diane, his mother, had done this before, under a different name, with an elderly man, 2 states over, who'd lost his house before anyone caught what was happening. She'd changed her legal name after a messy divorce and slipped under the radar of the one civil judgment against her. The 2 of them had built, slowly and carefully, an architecture around me, the friendly concern at holidays, the borrowed laptop, the standard paperwork, and, worst of all, a life insurance policy on baby Walter himself, small enough not to raise flags at intake, with Grant listed as the financial guardian of the funds until the child turned 18. Priya's team believed, though could not yet prove, that this was meant to be only the first of several policies. And Rachel knew almost none of it. That was the part that nearly broke me when Priya finally laid it out for me across her desk, case folder open, photographs of documents spread like a losing hand of cards. My daughter had been kept in a fog on purpose. Told her father was getting difficult since mom passed. Told the paperwork was routine. Told that keeping the new baby calm meant keeping his grandfather at arm's length for a while. She had been managed, the same as I had, just with softer tools. What do you need from me to end this? I asked Priya. All of it. Not just the fraud charge, the whole thing. We need it in the act, she said. Right now we have suspicious patterns and 1 forged authorization. We need Grant and Diane to move on real money believing you don't know anything is wrong. And we need you willing to let that happen in front of them. I thought about the 11 days of silence. I thought about my grandson's name. I said yes. The plan Priya and her team built over the following 2 weeks was not complicated so much as it was patient. The way the best traps in my old profession always were. The remote access software on my laptop was still live, still feeding every keystroke to wherever Grant was watching from. So Priya had me keep using that machine for exactly the kind of activity they wanted seen. Slow, careful typing. A man of my age fumbling his way through what looked like the beginning of a large financial decision. On a Tuesday morning, I sat down and wrote an email to a lawyer who did not exist, at a firm that did not exist, about an inheritance that did not exist. My late cousin Arthur, I wrote, had left me more than I expected, and I wanted advice on how best to fold it into my retirement accounts, and whether my son-in-law's suggestion of consolidating everything under one advisor made sense. I read it twice before I sent it, the way I always did with anything that mattered, and then I let it go out into the wire. Priya's team was watching from the other end. 2 days later, Rachel called and asked, in a voice that tried too hard to sound casual, if I'd been thinking about getting things more organized, now that I was on my own. I told her I had been, actually, that a little money had come in unexpectedly, and I wanted to do right by it. By her. By the baby. I could hear, underneath her carefulness, something that might have been relief, and it hurt more than anger would have, because I understood in that moment she thought she was helping her husband do something reasonable. Grant called himself that Friday, warmer than he had been on the phone in years, and offered to bring by a financial planner he trusted, a man he said had helped a lot of families in situations like ours. Priya's team was ready for that too. The financial planner who sat at my kitchen table the following week, taking notes on a leather folio, was, in fact, an undercover agent named Marcus Feld, and I sat across from him and Grant and played the part of a hopeful, slightly overwhelmed old man, letting Grant do most of the talking, watching him steer every question toward consolidation, toward access, toward a single account he could reach. It took 3 more weeks after that for the case to close. Weeks I mostly spent the way I always had, going to the grocery store, mowing the lawn, sitting in my recliner with the ball game on, except now every conversation with my daughter or my son-in-law carried a second conversation underneath it that only I could hear. Priya asked me more than once if I wanted to stop, if it was too much to carry. I told her the truth, that it was the hardest thing I had done since Carol's funeral, but that I had a grandson with my name, and I intended for him to grow up knowing his grandfather had not simply gone quiet and let this happen. The arrests came on a Wednesday. Grant was taken into custody at his office, in front of co-workers, on charges of computer fraud, wire fraud, and elder financial exploitation. Diane was arrested at the house she'd been renting under her changed name, and it turned out, once agents searched it, that she had files, actual paper files, kept the old-fashioned way on 4 other elderly people in 3 different states, men and women she had been building the same slow architecture around before Priya's investigation cut it short. My case, it turned out, wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of unraveling something much larger, and knowing that gave the whole ordeal a shape I could live with. Rachel found out everything the same day the warrants were served. I was the one who told her, sitting across from her at my kitchen table with the baby monitor Grant had bought clipped uselessly to her belt, no baby in the next room because she'd come to me alone. Walter with a sitter. I laid it out as gently as I could, though there is no gentle way to tell your daughter her husband tried to steal your life savings and insure her infant son for profit. She did not cry the way I expected. She went very still, the way I remembered her going still as a girl right before something broke loose in her. And she asked me one question. Did I do this to you? By letting him keep you away? No, I told her, and I meant it with everything I had left in me. You were managed the same as I was. He used your fear for the baby, and my grief over your mother, and he was patient enough about it that neither of us saw the whole shape until it was too late to see it ourselves. That's not the same as doing it. She stayed with me for 3 days after that, her and Walter, in the guest room that had been Carol's sewing room, and on the second night, unable to sleep, she came and sat with me in the living room while the baby slept against her shoulder, and she told me things I hadn't known, how Grant had discouraged her from calling me some weeks, told her I needed space, how Diane had shown her printouts, since proven fabricated, of things I had supposedly said about being tired of being needed. He had built walls between us out of the exact material a father and daughter are made of trusting. I keep thinking about the hospital, she said, about making you leave. I think about it every day. I know, I said. I do too. But I want you to hear me say this once, so you can stop turning it over. I was not angry that night. I was confused, and I was hurt, but I never once doubted that somewhere in you wanted me there. I could see it, even through the door. She cried then, finally, the way I think she'd needed to since the day her husband was led out of his office in handcuffs, and I sat with my daughter and my grandson in the room where I had raised her alone after her mother died, and understood something about the shape of my life that I don't think I'd have understood any other way. Every hard thing I'd survived, Carol's death, 31 years of reading other people's disasters for a living, had somehow built the particular patience it took to survive this one too. Grant pled guilty 8 months later rather than face trial, and is serving 4 years at a facility 2 states from here. Diane's case is more complicated, tangled up now with those other 4 families, and Priya tells me it may be another year before it's fully resolved, but the evidence, she says, is about as solid as evidence gets. Rachel filed for divorce within a month and has never once looked back at that decision in front of me, though I know some nights it's harder than she lets on. She and Walter live 20 minutes from me now, in a small rented house with a yard just big enough for a swing set. I put up myself, badly, on a Saturday, in October, cursing at the instructions the whole time while Rachel laughed at me from the porch with the baby monitor in her hand, the old one this time, the harmless kind. I see them most weekends, sometimes more. Last Sunday, Walter was 11 months old and just learning to pull himself up on things, and he stood at the edge of my recliner, gripping the armrest with both fists, looking at me with an expression of pure, undiluted determination, the kind only a baby can manage. Deciding whether the distance between the chair and my open arms was worth the risk, I held very still. I have learned, this year, the particular discipline of holding still and letting someone come to you in their own time, rather than reaching in and taking what you want. He let go of the chair. He took one wobbling step, then another, and fell forward into my arms with a small, delighted sound, like he'd known all along it would work out, like there was never really any doubt. I held him there a long moment, in the quiet of my own living room, no wire running to anywhere, no one watching, through a screen, nothing between us but a Sunday afternoon and the sound of my daughter in the next room. I thought about the man I was 3 hours down a flooded highway, driving through a storm to a door that wouldn't open for him. I thought about how close I came to simply going home that night, to letting it be one more small hurt I carried without asking questions, the way I'd carried so many small hurts since Carol died. I don't believe I did anything brave. I believe I did what any father would do once he understood what was actually being taken from him, and from his daughter, and from a boy too young to know any of it was happening. But I'll tell you what I've come to believe, sitting here now with my grandson's whole weight settled trusting against my chest. Love that never asks questions isn't devotion. It's an unlocked door, and somebody, eventually, will always walk through it if you never check who's on the other side. I loved my daughter and son-in-law enough to trust them without asking. I am learning, slowly, to love my daughter and grandson enough to pay attention instead. If you have someone older in your life who trusts too easily, someone who still picks up on the second ring out of habit, call them today, not because something is wrong, but because that is exactly the day nothing feels wrong that people like Grant and Diane are counting on the most.